Welcome to 2026 Scotland and Wales Election Analysis, a joint podcast by the Fraser of Allander Institute at the University of Strathclyde and the Wales Governance Centre at Cardiff University. My name is João Sousa. I'm a Deputy Director at the Fraser of Allander Institute, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Ed Poole and Guto Ifan, both from the Wales Governance Centre. Hello, guys.
Hi, how are you? Croeso, if podlediad.
I'll make it my mission by the end of this series to speak a little bit of Welsh, but I don't want to destroy any pronunciations. So we are going to do a series of podcasts, probably 2 to 3 a week, in the run-up to the Scottish and Welsh elections, both of which will take place on the 7th of May. So look out for that in our feed. But I guess, Ed, I'll come to you first. Why are we doing this?
This, I think, is going to be the Senedd and Scottish Parliament parliamentary elections with the greatest external analysis that we've ever seen since the start of devolution. So the Nuffield Foundation has provided some generous funding to our organisations to be able to look at not only what's been happening over the 6th Scottish Parliament and 6th Senedd term that's ending right now, but also the shape of what's to come. So what does a forecast look like for the incoming governments for the next 4 years in Wales, we've changed the term, or 5 years in Scotland?
See, I didn't actually know that. So this might be the first time, the last time for 20 years that we're going to be matching times of elections. So that's interesting yeah. As you said, we're really grateful to the Nuffield Foundation for providing this funding. We have already started our analysis. We have produced, each of our centres has produced a setting the scene report for Scotland and for Wales, looking at broad topics in terms of financing, how much that has changed over the past term, how much that looks like it will be for the coming 4 to 5 years, depending on the term. And we've had a look at some topics of interest. One of them has been health and social care, just because they are so important to spending, not just at all government levels, but devolved governments in particular. They make up such large proportions of what funding goes towards. We've had a look at post-school education as well, a bit more focus on colleges here, I think, than in your analysis. But in both cases, we've kind of looked at what's happening to the funding and in that regard. So over the coming few episodes, we're going to be discussing the themes that have emerged from this analysis. What are the main takeaways from the reports? But if you want to find those reports, you can go to either our website at the Fraser of Allander Institute, that's fraserofallander.org, or it will be in the Wales Governance Centre website, won't it?
Yes, that's right.
And we'll put the collections also in the project page on our website. But I think as a bit of a flavors starter, Guto, I wondered if you could tell us, 1 or 2 things that you think people should look out for in your report, looking at setting the scene in Wales.
So I guess one of the main messages is just how volatile the budget has been. Looking back at the last Senedd term, we've had two different governments at the UK level, 5 different chancellors. So it's a bit strange to sort of think back at it, all the different fiscal events, and there were sort of wild swings in the outlook for the Welsh government budget. I'm sure that it was the same with the Scottish budget. Looking back to to what we were doing before the last Senedd election, we thought that the outlook was particularly tight for this Welsh government. That all changed with the spending review back in 2021. But that, of course, was before the cost of living crisis, the massive spike in inflation following the war in Ukraine. That meant that those budgets were sort of blown out the water. The real terms value of those budgets were eroded. And one of the things that we do in the report is try to analyse how the Welsh government responded to that. So there was big sort of reprioritisation, emergency budget statements being made during that midterm period. They cut back on a whole host of areas to fund more spending on the NHS and on Transport for Wales. So because of lower passenger numbers on Welsh trains. Unfortunately, and this is a bit of a boring technical point, it is a lot, well, it's a lot harder than it should be to sort of properly analyse trends in Welsh government spending. And I'm not sure if that's something that you see in Scotland as well. Been tearing how little hair I've got left on my head on trying to make different sort of time series of different spending on different areas. It's very difficult. But what we can say is that during that midterm period in the last Senedd, there was a big reprioritisation towards healthcare. Health spending growth is now slowing up a bit. The Welsh Government sort of protected local government services, but some areas, just to pick out a couple, stuff like arts and culture, environmental protection, transport, higher education, apprenticeships, rural investment schemes, those were sort of significantly cut back towards those in those 2 years in the middle of the Senedd term and haven't recovered in real terms to next year.
Joe, how do you think the situation differs and is more similar in Scotland?
So I was really struck by some of the things that you mentioned, like emergency budget statements. That's just been something that has become part of the lingo in Scotland in the last few years, which is not a great way of ensuring that you're balancing the budget. But part of it is just the fact that there has been so much volatility. And as Guto said, the same things apply here. Budgets being completely eroded in real terms because of the high inflation. It's worth remembering that when we had elections for both these legislatures in 2021, we were still in the throes of the pandemic. So, we didn't know what the new normal would look like. And then it turns out the new normal appears to be quite volatile in terms of energy prices, but also there's quite a lot more government spending than was projected. Now, some of the forecasts and limits from beyond the previous spending review always looked pretty undeliverable. So some of it is kind of things just coming back to where a more sensible path appears to be. But we certainly have seen that kind of help smooth some things that look pretty hard to deliver in terms of the overall budget for the Scottish government. There's been a few differences, I think, here. One of them is that so much more of spending has gone into particularly consolidated pay, which is something that we've looked at in detail. That's really kind of storing up some difficulties for the Scottish government, whoever they are, after the election. And that's one of the big points that we've highlighted from our report, is that when you have Barnett consequentials, so Barnett consequentials are essentially the amount of money that comes from the equivalent of spending by the UK government to devolved governments to compensate for the fact that these functions are devolved. A lot of them came around the pandemic time. They were for one-off payments, they were called COVID bonuses or things like that. But the Scottish government chose to consolidate those, which means that they've put into base pay. And so every subsequent increase in pay comes from a higher base than you had done before or would have done in the absence of those. So that's making things quite tight. And then the other thing that I suppose is different here is that we have a significant devolution of social security benefits. They are not. They don't include two of the really big ones, which are universal credit or the state pension. They are things that aren't necessarily correlated with the economic cycle. They're things like disability payments, care support payments, things like that. But the other thing that we have done in Scotland is we've introduced and subsequently increased quite a lot the Scottish Child Payment, which has, it seems, had some effect on making child poverty lower than it would otherwise have been, but it also is around £600 to £700 million a year, I think, in the latest forecast. So it's a significant amount of money, and all these benefits they all come from within what is essentially a fixed budget. So there's no facility to borrow any additional demand for these benefits through borrowing or any other kind of flexibility in the budget like the UK government has. So that is something that has consumed a lot of debate in Scotland. A lot of people have I've mentioned the fact that this is a design that has the potential to kind of eat away at a lot of the rest of the budget. And although we have further income tax devolution powers than are available in Wales, those have already been used quite extensively, to the extent that rates are higher in Scotland for many people, not for everyone. They're lower for around half of people, but the differences are very small at that level, whereas they tend to be relatively high further up the income distribution. So it's not like that's a lever that's not been pulled at all, and for which there are lots of revenue raises to be done without pain.
So what do you think are going to be the big issues in the campaign coming up?
I think that there is going to be a lot on taxes because the Scottish government has used powers quite extensively in terms of creating new bands, holding thresholds lower than the rest of the UK. Public sector reform, that's kind of been acknowledged by the Scottish government that needs to happen, including reductions in numbers of public sector employees. And just what's happening with the health service. I think that is crucial because it's by far the biggest part of government spending. It's also one that lots of people interact with, and we're still, performance by the health service is still nowhere near where it was pre-pandemic in terms of waiting times. So although there has been a lot of expenditure to try and catch this back up, it's not something that happens overnight. And whether or not we really are in a position where things are moving towards kind of the right track is actually, I'm not a specialist in this, but from what I can tell, it does not appear like it's clear one way or the other. I don't know how that compares with what you guys are seeing in Wales.
Yeah, I think in the terms of the main issues, clearly the NHS is going to be, because as it's the largest area of devolved spending for all of the devolved governments, that's always going to be an area of a huge amount of attention. The incumbent government has been spending a lot of money in the last year to try and reduce waiting lists, just like the government has at Westminster. And it's to what extent is that reducing the waiting list, and to what extent is that expenditure getting a polling payoff, if you like, in terms of people's attitudes towards the NHS. I think tax, again, as you've mentioned, the powers are smaller and less useful in Wales. We aren't able to change the thresholds, the amounts of money at which you start paying different rates of tax. But we haven't changed the rates at all, even though that's a Senedd competence. But what seems to be happening is that the parties are falling over themselves to either say that they're not going to increase income tax, or in fact might reduce income tax, but actually all of the while ignoring the fact that the Welsh government historically in the last decade or so has allowed the Welsh budgets to not fall as much as British budgets by allowing council tax to go up much more rapidly than has been the case in England, and certainly the case in Scotland, where Scotland's had a council tax freeze. And there's a revaluation on the books in primary law coming up for 2028. And so will the parties want to undertake to go ahead with that, knowing that revaluation always creates winners and losers, and the winners are quite happy and won't make any noise, but the losers certainly will from any kind of reassessment of the value of their property. So I think tax, NHS, and the broader picture of how much a new government can increase spending on areas like childcare and transport and all the other areas of the budget, given the quite restricted fiscal outlook that is broadly still set by decisions by the Chancellor in London.
I was quite struck at the sort of the differences and similarities in terms of the public sector and public sector pay and sort of efficiency considerations. We haven't really seen a sort of a clear plan, nothing like the medium-term financial strategy that the Scottish government have. We don't have sort of a plan published by the Welsh government, and I think some of the parties might want to consider what you do with the civil service, the number of public sector workers, over the next few years, what role does efficiency play in sort of meeting, and productivity plays in meeting those sort of spending pressures that you're going to feel in the context of quite tight budgets? One sort of difference between Wales and Scotland is that generally Wales we haven't seen that ratcheting up effect of those one-off payments being consolidated into pay deals for Welsh public sector workers. I think on the latest data showed that median full-time wages or salaries in the public sector in Scotland is still about 10% higher than in Wales now.
That's a lot.
That actually, interestingly, it means that the difference, that differential between public and private is actually similar in Wales and Scotland, about 14%. But that's because the median private sector wages in Wales are 10% lower as well compared to Scotland. But we haven't seen that sort of big financial pressure, even though it has been one of the big area of pressures that the Welsh Government has faced and will have to face over the coming years, particularly in the context of we're inevitably expecting inflation to pick up over the next year or so.
Yeah, I suppose one of the things that's really different in terms of public sector pay is that the Scottish Government's got a near blanket collective bargaining approach, whereas the Welsh government, I think, for many of the occupations, certainly still relies on the pay review bodies. And I think there's evidence that certainly Scottish negotiations tend to come from the pay review bodies' evidence, and then it only seems to go one way, and that is up from there. But that's really interesting that you mentioned the differentials kind of being the same still in percentage terms. That is something that I didn't appreciate before, and I think will surprise some of our listeners. I think we don't have too much time, so I will just ask you about the capital spending outlook for Wales, because it looks pretty tight for Scotland, and I imagine it will be relatively similar for Wales, because this is all driven by UK government decisions on where they're placing their massively increasing capital budget. But actually, a lot of it is going on defence and on business and trade. Both of those have very little or no devolved powers.
Yeah, so we're sort of in current forecasts and current inflation forecasts, we think the capital budget, the core capital budget will fall by about 5% in real terms to 2029 over this sort of spending review period. It'll increase a bit next year before falling back. The Welsh Government can only borrow 150 or 165 million pounds next year. That's going to increase in line with inflation now, but that's not going to sort of increase massively. So yeah, it's going to be tight in terms of the capital budget, especially in the context of the parties making quite big promises on capital spending already. The Welsh Government has been making use of sort of private finance through what they term the mutual investment model, but that tends to be more expensive in the long run, and we're starting to see the sort of the revenue impacts now of those capital projects starting to come into the budget. So, for example, the day-to-day transport spending budget has gone up significantly over the last 2 years because of those sort of payments to those private finance initiatives starting to be made on delivery and completion of those projects. So right. That might be an attractive proposition in terms of in the context of a declining capital budget, but it is more expensive than borrowing. It's more expensive, of course, than using the general capital budget, which is going to be falling.
What about capital in Scotland?
I mean, it's very similar in that regard, which is perhaps unsurprising because it's driven by the Barnett formula in many ways. But yeah, we're over the spending review period, it's falling by 0.1% a year. But then if you look at just the next 3 years, it's kind of a roller coaster. So 5% up in real terms, then down 0.8, then down 4% the next year. So it's really, you could argue it's not a very sensible way of running this, and in fact it's already caused some difficulties for the Scottish Government, because they were looking at the plans that they had before, and they just looked unaffordable, and so there was essentially a reckoning in the Scottish budget that this was just undeliverable by the tune of several hundreds of millions of pounds. But I think, just like in Wales, that there'll be lots of people proclaiming that they would like to make new investments on roads and things like that look pretty unaffordable if they're going to be over and above what's already in the plans. So that's all we have time for. So do join us over the rest of the week, as we will be delving into the financing of the Scottish and Welsh governments. But for now, all that's left for me to say is thank you, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.